Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. I've talked to him before. His name is Walter Bosley. Last name is Bosley. And we've done a number of shows on the Walter Bosley channel, the YouTube channel. We covered some of his books, The Mystery of Ingersoll Lockwood, The Empire of the Wheel, an investigation of occult espionage. I've been on his show talking about the West Memphis Three, Scarlet Blake, who's a tranny, Aleister Crowley, The Doors. But today we're going to talk about a book he recently published. And if you're watching this on Rumble or Rockfin or X, you'll see the cover. It's the second in a two-book compendium called Esoteric Napoleon. So this is Esoteric Napoleon 2, and there's obviously an Esoteric Napoleon 1. I have not read through the books, but I'm very familiar with kind of the Napoleonic history. And we were talking a little bit on the pre-show of things that I've been covering, which are the Knights of Malta, and Napoleon kicked them out of Malta in 1798. And then Walter was telling me he hired them back, which I was not aware of, but it is an interesting part of kind of Western civilization. And there's a lot about Napoleon that reaches our shores here in the U.S. that Walter can talk more about. So Walter, welcome to the show.
It's good to be back, William.
Yeah, excellent. So for people who haven't heard our earlier shows, maybe you can do a little overview of your writing and your your YouTube channel, your website, what you've been up to, and then what led to the publication of Esoteric Napoleon.
Sure. Well, for a long time, I wrote fiction, an aspiring to be published writer. Wrote screenplays, and I wrote my first nonfiction book in 2007. That's Latitude 33, Key to the Kingdom, which was my investigation into strange engineering. I don't want to overuse the word esoteric, but metaphysical, what have you, engineering of Disneyland, the original park in California. And, one thing leads to another, and the next three books I write focus on this cold case, which at the time I learned about it was almost 100 years. It was like 96, 97 years prior. It happened in San Bernardino in 1915. And that was, wow, that kicked off a 7-year period of my life. That was the Empire of the Wheel trilogy. And after that, I wanted a break from such dark material as was in that Empire of the Wheel series. And so I wrote my first book in what I call the Secret Missions series, which is where I look at historical figures, explorers, in the case of Napoleon, of course, a military leader and national leader. And these are historical figures who I found evidence to argue that they had kind of, as the title of the series implies, a secret mission. For instance, the first book is about Juan Cabrillo, and I lay out in there how his whole exploration of California had an ulterior motive that had to do with the Templars and lost treasure and things like that. And then the second book was the lost expedition of Sir Richard Francis Burton. That's Secret Missions 2. And in that, I go into this curious missing 4.5-month period of his life that he did not write about. Now, Richard Francis Burton wrote profusely about everything he did. I mean, some of the most boring stuff you'll ever read are the things he wrote about his journeys and expeditions, except for this 4-month period that he was in the wilderness, the jungles of South America. And to this day, we don't know what he did. So, it's my hypothesis that he was secretly exploring lost cities and other megalithic mysteries and ancient mysteries that are very popular with us today. Well, from there, I did a book on Ambrose Bierce, who famously disappeared in 1913. After declaring more than once in print that he wanted to disappear off into South America. To this day, we don't know what happened to Ambrose Bierce. And in that book, I explore what his secret mission may have been, because there's evidence that he was a Secret Service agent from the end of the Civil War until he disappeared. So in each of my books, and particularly in each of the Secret Missions books, somewhere along the way in the research, I turn up something or stumble upon something that has led to the next book. Well, in the case of Napoleon Bonaparte, I had for several years been curious about this legend that he had spent a night in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. And when he emerged from the pyramid, he was just pale and just white, just nervous and freaked out. And when he was asked, hey, what happened in there? He said, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. And I've always found this story intriguing, but I didn't know much about Napoleon Bonaparte other than that and what we're taught in movies and school. Well, I came across a book in a used bookstore, Bonaparte in Egypt by Christopher Harold. I think it was written in the 30s or 40s. And I thought, well, this is interesting because I'm also interested in the Louisiana Purchase, right? It's interesting that, he owned this and he sells it to the United States, practically gives it to us. Well, when I'm reading the book, Bonaparte in Egypt, I'm learning all sorts of things about this man that were never taught, that he was fascinated with science and ancient history and technology and things like that. He was really into the things that, I'm into and a lot of us are into. And he was criticized by some of his military officers because when he went on his Egyptian expedition, he took what they call these savants. These were the guys who were the scientific geniuses of their day: engineering, ancient history, languages, linguistics, alchemy, and several of them were Freemasons. Okay. And he took a bunch of them and gave them, they got upper class status on the ships heading down there, and they were to be treated with respect. And this wasn't just an expedition of military conquest. Okay. This was, he was as interested in the ancient history of Egypt as he was anything. And he wanted to block the British access to India if he could, because he wanted to go on to India. So he was fascinated with ancient history and lost civilizations and esoteric thought and metaphysical technologies and all this stuff that we're into today. And the more I read about him, the more I got a completely different view than what we're taught. He wasn't just this brooding megalomaniac that was all about his power and his ego. I learned that reputation is the product of, by now, over 200 years of, quite frankly, British propaganda and nonsense. But in this, I also learned that in 1802, when France got the Louisiana Territory back, and I knew this when I was doing the first book, I learned it when I was doing the first book, Napoleon ordered his Navy Secretary, Decrès, to put together a special team and under strictest secrecy to send them to explore the Louisiana Territory. Okay. And so they had about a year before we know that the sale was made to the United States for this team to be secretly exploring, looking for something. But we never see any, I've not found any documentation yet, and I've been looking, that it happened or what they found, what the result was, if they found, whatever it was they were looking for. So I was fascinated about this. And when you know anything about Thomas Jefferson, at the time, he had the largest personal library in what was the United States back then. Okay. And he was a guy who was fascinated with ancient history and architecture and all these mysteries, and also India. John Adams had turned him on to India. And we're talking about Thomas Jefferson here. So it was interesting that he makes this deal with Thomas Jefferson, who is a man who shares a lot of the same interests that Napoleon Bonaparte, was enthused about. And so this really fascinated me. And when you throw in that Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? He's murdered within 3 years after his expedition through the Louisiana Territory occurs. And so the whole thing, all of this is in the mix. Napoleon and what I learned about him and his interest, the secret expedition that he orders to explore the Louisiana Territory, and then this whole thing about Meriwether Lewis being murdered. And it just, I had to write this book, this second volume, about all of this.
It's pretty amazing. So it's almost like an intercontinental story. So he bought the Louisiana Purchase, was sold in 1802. Lewis and Clark is 1804, right? So these are like important dates or something like that.
Yeah. I think they started in late 1803, but with all the hiring of the people, but it was mostly 1804 through 1806. Gotcha. Was the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Just this huge swath of land purchased.
Yeah, right? It doubled. It literally, maybe even a little more than doubled the size of the United States. And Jefferson, he made the purchase on executive order without authority or permission from the Congress. And when they found out, they were livid. Wow. Until it was explained to them. Hey, and the War of 1812, if it wasn't fully explained, that fully got them on board, because, by Napoleon selling us this, he effectively prevented the British from controlling the Mississippi and being able to squeeze us from the seaboard to the river.
Right. There's the famous Battle of Andrew Jackson, 1812 or something like that. And
the Battle of New Orleans, which was actually fought after the war had officially ended. They just didn't know.
They didn't know, but it was a famous kind of stoppage. Yeah. So that was,
it's still, they were still, even the British Navy guys didn't know that it was over, and they wanted to get up that river.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. So, I mean, it was sold. I mean, that was the purpose of Napoleon selling it was to gain coinage for his wars or whatever, just to pay off debts, right?
Yeah. And also to kind of, flip the bird to the British, to make it harder for them, when because he knew they were they were still, miffed at us for embarrassing their glorious empire with our revolution. The fact that we really just stubbornly stuck it out.
Right. They burned down Washington in 1812, so the White House still has the marks, the char marks from it being burnt down if you walk through it.
And this is part of the fact that twice they tried to subdue us, twice they failed. This is a great reason why their animus against Napoleon fired up even more, because we had embarrassed them really on the international stage, in front of their peers. And now here was Napoleon leading France, and there was nothing he couldn't accomplish except building a good navy. That was the thing he could never do, was get a really great navy. If he had been able to, I would say the British would have lost. But yeah, they were just so fanatically hateful of him. And they stirred up their European peers. When I say that, I mean their dynastic peers and their oligarch peers, because what Napoleon would do, I read, almost 7,000 pages of biographical and historical material on Napoleon Bonaparte, dating from written during his lifetime on up to, just a few years ago. And in the centuries in between. And when you actually dive into the story of Napoleon and you read all these different histories, if you don't come away with a different view of the man, then you're just being stubborn. You're just saying, I just want to cling to the status quo, because, you find out, like I was telling you before, how all but one of the so-called Napoleonic Wars were started by the British and the European allies. He only started one, and it wasn't the first one that kicked all this off.
I mean, there's so many different famous battles, Austerlitz and all the
Oh
stuff. The
yeah.
most recent movie that came out, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
which I was disappointed with that. Uh Partially. That actually is a well-made film, and it actually tells the story of he and of Napoleon and Josephine really well, because they did have that kind of relationship. Even the parts that made everybody snicker, that was part of the historical record. Well, one of her maids, I think they mentioned it in the movie, but that's true. One of the housemaids had sold the dirty letters that he had written to Josephine from
oh
various
wow,
places, and the newspapers of the day published these things. I
oh
mean,
wow.
it was, and so he was livid and embarrassed, and so the film really captured that well. But Ridley Scott disappointed me with, he fell back on the Napoleon propaganda, making him look like a crazy nut, and it just
He couldn't have been that crazy because he kept winning battles almost all the
yes,
way
he
to
did.
the end. I mean,
Oh, he was beating them at their own
yeah,
empire game, and
yeah,
that's the other thing that really pissed off the British. And just so people understand, when you hear me in the context of talking about Napoleon and things like this, when I refer to the British, I'm referring to the oligarchy, I'm referring to the monarchy, I'm referring to their elites. I'm not referring to the British people, because even in those days, the British leadership was worried that he would win over the British people, because a lot of them were hearing things from other sources and going, hey, we're kind of interested in this guy, because what he was doing, this is what you don't learn in school or in the movies. He would go in, and yes, the countries that he would defeat and that he would conquer, he would set them up on a much more democratic leaning system. And they were realizing pretty quickly, oh, wow, wait a minute. We kind of have more freedom than we did before. And he's improving our municipalities. Okay. And what was happening was he was improving the lives of the common people in these countries that he conquered. Well, the dynasties and the oligarchies, they can't have that, because they got to keep the people down. Historians generally credit Napoleon Bonaparte with being the one figure who ended officially, formally, the feudal system. The feudal system still existed, and Napoleon Bonaparte and what he did, it officially pretty much brought to an end the feudal system in Europe, and they hated him for that.
I believe it. I believe it. Right. So he's coming after the French Revolution, right? So
Yeah,
this is
he
the
was
king.
an officer during the Revolution. Yeah.
Right. So he's having these battles against the royalist forces, right?
Well, here's the interesting thing. He didn't like the royalists. Okay, he wasn't on their side. He was on the side of, the revolutionaries,
The Republic.
until the terror started. Now, the terror, of course, as we know, is when they really started going crazy and chopping everybody's heads off. Okay, and Napoleon wrote letters. These are part of the historical record, in which he said that was the point at which they kind of lost him, because he said they're going too far. They're ruining the cause with all this insane bloodshed. So he kind of stopped short of, he was on their side in the revolution, but he stopped short once they just started going into a killing frenzy.
Right. It was Robespierre, I guess. So
Yeah,
eventually
they started killing their own revolutionary leaders. That tells you how nuts they went.
they ended up in the jaws of the tiger, so to speak. So he came through all that. I mean, what other things would you say about the record of Napoleon are more authentic than what you're told through, British propaganda, who've always propagandized against their enemies?
The one of the best sources I can tell people is to read the books by a British historian named Andrew Roberts, who takes a lot of crap from his peers. He wrote a book. He's written a few books on Napoleon, but the one you should read is Napoleon the Great. And he lays out in his books and in lectures you can find online, he lays out the reason why Napoleon's reputation and image and name deserves a rehabilitation from the British propaganda, from the oligarchic propaganda, because he lays out detail after detail, fact after fact, that the popular image of this man is not an accurate image. And it's really not right, because to this day, things that Napoleon did, envisioned, and under his leadership and guidance, exist to this day. The way cities are laid out and municipalities are run, this can be traced back to, Napoleon's French Empire. And he really was a genius for state administration. Okay. Now, what's interesting
The
is
Napoleonic Code. A lot of people don't know that as well. So
the
French system has a different code because of him.
As far as him being this despot and this crazy emperor, people say, oh, he crowned himself. No, what he did was, when the Pope was going to put the crown on his head, the popes were known. They'd done this since Charlemagne. What the popes would do when they crowned a French king was they'd throw in their little Latin phrase that basically said, the church is allowing you to be the emperor. The church approves. So when the Pope puts the crown on the king's head, well, what happened with Napoleon was, the Pope lifted the crown. Napoleon took it out of his hands. Napoleon never put it on his head. He held it above his head, and he did it with his own hands. And the statement that he was making was, I represent the people, and it's the people putting this crown on my head, not the church.
Yeah, not anointed by the church.
Right. Yeah. Because he was very mindful of the political peccadillos of the Vatican. And he's like, no, the church in France is not in charge of France. It's
the king had just been beheaded, right? King and Antoinette or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he had to have been very sensitive to that.
Sure.
He didn't say, I found the crown, or maybe he wrote it. I found the crown in the gutter.
I think he wrote it. I don't recall him saying it at the coronation, but after he does that, he hands, he sets it aside or something, and all this stuff about him being this stiff, humorless megalomaniac. When at the coronation, he and Josephine and his entourage, they had gone to the wrong door. And so they're standing in the side at the wrong door, and they find this out at the last minute. And Napoleon makes some joke like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot, that kind of thing. And they kind of laughed, embarrassed. The guy had a good sense of humor about himself, particularly when he flubbed up. There was one battle. It wasn't Waterloo. It was late in the game there when he started getting distracted, and he, lost a couple of battles. There was one that they were racing away from. He had to flee. And as he was riding away, one of his generals was next to him. And he says, well, we really screwed that one up, didn't we? And he was just kind of like, oh, shoot, what a dummy, kind of thing. And so this man actually had a much, much more human personality and sense of humor. And but he was a genius. I mean, his military tactic, his military style and knowledge is studied in war colleges to this day. That's what a brilliant, he was an artillery officer, primarily. But his first love, his real love was ancient history and these lost civilizations kind of stuff. And when after Waterloo happened and he knew, that's it, I'm not emperor around. Yeah, after the second time, my political career, he said, I don't want a political career anymore. What he was doing was he pulled together a library and field equipment. Okay. And he told his brother and a couple of others, he said, look, I'm going to go to America and just spend the rest of my life in literally, scientific exploration and study. And that's what he wanted to do. He even said, I'm going to go out and explore California, but I just forget this. I'm going to go to the Americas. So that's why it's kind of weird that he so easily stuck behind and let himself be arrested by the British, because here's a little thing that you're also not taught in school and in the movies. A U.S. Navy frigate was sent to France and was off the coast of not La Rochelle. I can't. It begins with an R. I'm doing a brain dump. The city they were in where the British arrested him. A U.S. frigate, Navy ship, arrives, and a boat, a small craft, is sent with 2 U.S. Navy officers waiting for him. Okay, and they let it be known, we're waiting to bring the emperor to America. And Napoleon's brother, Joseph, who looked astonishingly like him and had been used as a double for Napoleon during his lifetime for security purposes. The witnesses there, the people there with him documented this. This is documented history. His brother Joseph begged him, switch places with me. They'll never know the difference until it's too late. There's a Navy ship, an American Navy ship waiting to take you to the States. Get on that boat now. And we're taught that Napoleon, after gathering all his stuff to go explore the Americas like he said he was going to do, okay, we're told that he says, no, I'm going to trust the British. They're going to treat me like a gentleman, and that he didn't take Joseph up on the deal. But here's the interesting thing. I don't even say Napoleon was on St. Helena. I call him the Bonaparte refugee, because I believe they did switch places, and that's not original with me. That's something that some scholars have increasingly believed for the last 50 years, that he did switch places with Joseph. But here's the interesting thing. While the Bonaparte refugee on St. Helena was being interviewed by a British historian assigned by the authorities in England to interview Napoleon, so to speak, we are told, he comes back and reports to his superiors. He goes, I don't think this is Napoleon. Guys, I really don't think this is him. And we're not told what he was told. And Joseph Bonaparte, look it up, so-called Joseph, I put air quotes around the first name, is known to history to have lived in the United States until the 1830s, late 1830s. He lived in Philadelphia. He lived in New Jersey. And on the street in Philadelphia, I believe it was, he's walking down the street and a Frenchman comes up and says, Mon Emperor. And we're told that Joseph says, oh, no, you're mistaken. I'm his brother, Joseph. And the guy says, no, I know my emperor, and this guy had been a personal guard of Napoleon's. Okay. So, so yes, in the first book, the last part of the book is I lay out that I do believe, I'm one of those that believes he took up the offer and traded identities with his brother Joseph. I explain why and how that could have worked. And it's all based
Wasn't
on
the grandson of Napoleon in Lincoln's cabinet or something like
the
that?
great nephew, Napoleon's younger brother. That younger brother's grandson was Charles Bonaparte. And he became he was born in Baltimore, Maryland. He became the Secretary of the Navy under Teddy Roosevelt. Interesting, Charles Bonaparte was the Secretary of the Navy who facilitated the return of John Paul Jones's remains from Paris when they were discovered. But Charles Bonaparte went on after that to become Attorney General, and he created what was known as the Bureau of Investigation, which was federal level. And for 20 years, it was the BI. It was known to be lazy and corrupt, unfortunately. And in 1928, it became the FBI. So Charles Bonaparte started the FBI, really, as well.
Amazing. So this is this amazing history. So Bonaparte might have been switched out. I mean, it is a strange life. He literally ended his military career at a fairly young age, 45 or 46. Yeah. I mean, in all, how many wins did he have in a row? 10 wins. He loved Alexander too. He liked to read about Alexander.
Yeah. He there were some disasters on the Egyptian expedition, but they of course are characterized to make him look evil. And then there's all the nonsense about him being the first of three antichrists that Nostradamus predicted. Here's the truth about that, okay? Because I get that thrown at me all the time. I go, well, that's nonsense, because the man who first started that rumor, okay, who wrote about that, this was, I think, in the late 19th century or the very early years of the 20th century. He based his whole hypothesis on that, on a very bad translation of Nostradamus. And he himself admitted that, and admitted that, nah, it was a bad translation. Essentially, he admitted that he made that up. So the whole thing about Nostradamus allegedly, identifying Napoleon as the first Antichrist, people say, but in Nostradamus's book, it says, and I'm telling you, folks, that's a bad translation. It's not accurate. It's not true. Nostradamus did not really identify Napoleon, but it was part of the propaganda. It just became the thing to do. Trash Napoleon because, hey, we all know he's evil, right?
Right. He's an enemy of the royal crown. So if you come from the English-speaking world, you're going to look at him like
it's still done today to leaders who aren't liked.
But he's also interesting. Like, I think he was Corsican too. So he's kind of like really Mediterranean.
He's Italian. He essentially, his mother, her last name was Ramolino. She was Italian. The man who's supposed to be his father, Carlo Bonaparte, because their names were Bonaparte, and then he Francoized it, whatever, turned it French when he got the French, some government guy to approve Napoleon and Joseph to go to school, get them a slot in military academies in France. So that's when they were turned French. Napoleon was always kind of teased throughout his life because he spoke French with an Italian accent. He never quite got the French accent down, but
but that's also kind of a place of a lot of mystery and stuff like that, like old tombs and other civilizations are all over the place.
And I was going to say his father, and this is all in the first book, but his father, the man identified, Carlo Bonaparte, might not have been his real father. And I go into all that in the first book.
Interesting. Yes, it really is an interesting life. So he was in Egypt. And have you heard the rumor? I think we were talking this pre-show, like he supposedly cannonaded off the nose of
the whole thing about the blasting the nose off of my understanding from the sources, when you really look at that, is that it was a group of Muslims who had done that, and maybe some third country nationals, as we call them in the military world, who were, hired as mercenaries by the French army. Napoleon would have been appalled at the destruction, because think about it. He brings hundreds of these savants to study. Egyptology started with Napoleon's Egyptian expedition.
Interesting.
Okay?
That's right.
Now,
there's a lot of famous French Egyptologists. I think one of the original guys who was trying to decipher the glyphs or whatever they are was French, right? Wasn't that his name? I forgot his name.
Yeah. Later on, we're told that the translation of the Rosetta Stone was, of course, done by British historians, and I argue in the book that there's reason to suspect that the translation was done by the French before the year that we're told that it was. Because here's what's interesting. Here's another level of intrigue with Napoleon. One of his officers was Colonel de Hautpoul. Okay, now de Hautpoul was the nephew of Madame de Hautpoul, whose grave factors heavily in the Rennes-le-Château mystery.
Oh, interesting.
Can
you explain that to people who don't know what that is?
In the Rennes-le-Château mystery, there is a suspicion, let's call it a hypothesis, hypothesis that the remains of Mary Magdalene were buried in France because she had made it to Europe, and you know, her remains are buried in France. And there was this priest in the late 19th century, Berenger Saunier, Father Saunier, who, while he is fixing the altar in the church, he's a priest, the church that he's assigned to in this little village, Rennes-le-Château, he finds these documents that were hidden inside the altar. And what he found in the documents was very shocking. He goes to Paris to talk to the church authorities. And then after that, he seems to have an endless supply of money. The church in Paris and the Vatican leave him alone. They let him do what he wants. He's able to fix roads and everything in the village, and just live a lifestyle that priests normally, you know, usually didn't live. And so the intrigue is that, what did he find? What was this information that he found? And part of the mystery is that there's this artist, Nicolas Poussin, who did this painting called Three Shepherds, which famously has the phrase "et in Arcadia ego," which a lot of people refer to the painting. And it shows these three shepherds at different stages of, you know, age: young man, middle-aged man, old man. And there's a skull on the gravesite. Well, they're all pointing to this gravesite, this tomb and such. And this all points to an actual gravesite wherein is buried a woman, Madame de Hautpoul. Okay. And there's all this intrigue as to, okay, the Poussin art points to her, and it all points to Rennes-le-Château, and you know, yeah, that's it right there. The, you know, the big mystery. And so it's interesting that we have a relative of Madame de Hautpoul on the Egyptian expedition. He's an officer in Napoleon's army, and he's there with the man who discovers the Rosetta Stone for the first time. And the Rosetta Stone has physical connections to Madame de Hautpoul's grave marker. So that's why this whole de Hautpoul thing, you know, it's
the Rosetta Stone was found as part of just a wall somewhere. Like it was just like lying on
the story is that the guy who found it literally stepped on it, stumbled upon it. Yeah, in ruins, ancient ruins. Now, I, you know, suggest in the book that it was that the discovery was a planted discovery, that this had been found under some other means, and
you know, I release it to the public or something.
Yeah, I think the translation was done before Napoleon even left Egypt of the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, I mean, this some people have analyzed this whole painting. There's like geometric elements to it that go outside, like something very mysterious.
Oh, and here's another thing that's interesting. A descendant of Nicolas Poussin, he was an officer in Napoleon's army, and when all the Bonapartists after Waterloo fled to the United States, this Poussin became an officer in the U.S. Army, and he was an engineering officer. Okay, so cartography and geography were his things, and that's what he did for the U.S. Army. So, you know, I wonder what might he have known, because there is some argument to be made that some of Poussin's paintings were pointing to a landscape in America, in the Americas, and that has to do with all the Arcadia stuff going on, because at an Arcadia ego, right? So,
so
you gotta wonder.
They called the like northern Canada today Arcadia. They were called Arcadians, right? So.
Yeah, and this is where Cajun comes from, because when the British, once again, that wonderful British Empire, forced all those people out of their homes because, well, they wanted it, they all had to come down the coast or down, you know, land, you know, across the land, and that's where a lot of them ended up down in the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, and the American Southeast, and that's where the term Cajun comes from. Arcadians, Cajun.
Right. It's incredible history. Really is something else, like the French world and all that stuff. But Somebody asked, and the Rip Dog asked, I've read the writings that Napoleon had very perverse sexual practices, was possibly the Aleister Crowley of his day. Any truth to that?
No, those are British exaggerations. I mean, unless you call,
did he have any connection to
oral sex is what is
Desaad?
the big deal,
he wrote about that. Did he have any connections to Desaad? Desaad was in the Bastille, and when it was overthrown, right? So
not in almost 7,000 pages of what I read.
Come across it.
Yeah, I didn't come across that, and he was not, as far as being a Crowley of his day. I didn't find anything where he got into any kind of black magic either, any kind of magic at all.
Interesting.
Low level psychic stuff, he experienced, but
nothing like serious. Like
but that's all part of that propaganda. Whenever you hear stuff like that, it's all the propaganda.
Yeah, no, he has a much more interesting guy. Incredible talent, like his empire building.
A much more respectable man than he gets credit for. I am, pro Bonaparte. This guy, he was not perfect. What leader is, but he was not the evil devil, megalomaniac despot that so many people just accept. That he
Did you find there was truth to like the stories of him reading books late into the night by himself and just?
Oh yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. Really I mean, he carried an extensive library on the ship that took him down to Egypt. I mean, he traveled with a library wherever he went. This guy was a voracious reader. He was fascinated with, again, these kind of, what we would call these Indiana Jones type of interests. He was fascinated with that.
Interesting. Well, Walter, it's Friday night. It's almost 6:00.
Wow.
You have 2 books. Where can people find Esoteric Napoleon 1 and 2?
It's real easy. They can go to walterbosley.com.
And those are signed copies too, right?
No. I can always arrange with someone if they want a signed copy. That costs a little bit more because of all the double shipping and stuff that goes on. But no, they can go to walterbosley.com, and that's where the link to my books are, and all sorts of other things.
So I'll put a link to your website, and you have your link to. I know you have an active YouTube channel too, right?
Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. Absolutely, check that out.
And there you're with Todd Wood, and I'll put links to both the YouTube channel and to your website so people can check out these books and your other books. Like I've read these other Ingersoll Lockwood; those are really cool. So, thanks so much for your time. Again, it's Walter Bosley is the author, and the title of the books we kind of covered today are Esoteric Napoleon 1 and 2, and it's Friday, so everybody have a great weekend. Thanks, Walter.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Stay there.